we're often outranking Heineken and some of the other big brands in Coles and Woolworths. We're not advocating for a world without alcohol, we're just advocating for more balance. Robbie Williams, as a strategic investor as well, alcohol consumption in Australia and the US is the lowest it's ever been since records began. Part of the reason why they've cut back is the fear of being drunk and getting filmed doing something stupid.
We just want you to do your best, whatever that is.
Anyone who's done business in the US knows that it's complicated and expensive and everything costs you twice as much. We really were kind of the first indie craft brand in Australia to hit the market. There's also been a lot of really genuine support from the retailers in supporting little Aussie brand that is taking on some of the big guys. We've said, we're not going to destroy your alcoholic revenue. We're going to subsidize it with non-alc alternatives.
Fantastic Aussie alcohol-free drink, Heaps Normal.
And I was thinking it would be absolutely appropriate to have a Heaps Normal today. And I thought we could start this on the pod. Oh, that sounds good. Oh, I love it. I love it.
Beat us to it.
Yeah. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about sort of what I'm drinking and the brand behind it.
Yeah, so Heaps Normal is coming up to its 6th birthday in July this year. And we're a dedicated non-alcoholic beer brand. We're 100% Australian owned, independent, and B Corp. The company was started by a few mates who all had different reasons for wanting to cut back on the booze. So Andy, our CEO, and Ben, who was our head brewer but now chief product officer, both came from craft beer. They both worked at Young Henry's and a bunch of other breweries over the years, and kind of just observed the culture within that industry and the kind of very close to the race to the bottom, blackout drunk Aussie drinking culture and mentality. So I kind of experienced that firsthand and wanted to present an alternative to that. And the other co-founder was Geordie Smith, who's still on the World Surfing Pro Tour circuit, and he decided a few years back that he was going to cut drinking completely out when he was on tour. Obviously for health reasons and just for that additional kind of performance boost. So he came on board with Ben and Andy at the beginning as well. Since then, we've grown from a tiny little startup into one of the top performing non-alcoholic beer brands in Australia. And we're often now kind of outranking Heineken and some of the other big brands in Coles and Woolworths, which is great. A great feeling for an independent brand that isn't beholden to those big corporate agendas. So we're in a really good position in terms of our growth and our sales. And I think we've done that by really not focusing on the booze at all the wellness aspects of drinking or not drinking, and deliberately not preaching the benefits of cutting back on booze. And so that's been a really big part of our brand positioning from the very beginning. Since we launched in Australia, since we've grown here, we've entered the US, the UK, and we're exploring new categories outside of beer as well over the next couple of years. So that's probably one of the more exciting things that's on the cards for us over the next couple of years. And then most recently, we've opened our venue, Heaps Normal Health Club in Sydney, which is a 300 cap at the moment, live music and dance hall. But over time, that will evolve into what we're calling a weird wellness space. So there'll be a whole bunch of different kind of rooms and features within the venue that articulate our version of wellness, which is all about kind of socializing and having fun and hanging out with your mates and enjoying a gig and all that sort of stuff. So that's Heaps Normal in a nutshell.
It's an epic Aussie story, and I love that. I love brands that are punching well above their weight, and I feel like you guys have done that in a really, really quick time and taken on some of those giants in a category where those giants have really owned that category, which we'll touch on today. And I think there's probably 1,000 pieces within just that intro alone that I'm excited to dive into, with sort of Geordie Smith and his involvement, the drinking culture, that international expansion, potentially some of those new categories, if we can touch on it. But then also, I thought actually we'll just go back a step, because I'm really interested, I guess, in your journey as well, because before you've found yourself at Heaps Normal, I think you've had a really, really interesting background with, time at Combank, Mirvac, the Sydney Opera House, all, crazy, interesting businesses, but very, very different to A, the CPG space, and then, B, the brand that you're in today. So I guess I'd love to hear more about that journey, how you've ended up where you are and what you've taken probably from each of those chapters that's helped you, in your current role.
So yeah, started my career at Combank almost 20 years ago, actually in HR. So I was a HR grad there and spent, 9 months in the HR graduate program and did a whole bunch of different jobs within that part of the business. And then as part of that program, you get to do 3 months in another department. And I majored in management and marketing, so I was like, I'll give marketing a crack for a few months. And so they put me in the brand team at CommBank just as they were going through the Can brand relaunch, which is crazy to think is almost 20 years ago now. But I just loved it straight away. Like, I loved the work, I loved the people, I loved the ability to have a kind of creative outlet at work as well, the data driven scientific side of marketing. And so spent 4 or 5 years at CommBank in various roles within the marketing and brand team. I did a bit of data driven marketing. I did a bit of time in the brand team, spent a bit of time copywriting. So I got a really well-rounded producing TVC. So I got a really well-rounded experience when I was kind of in my early 20s. And so that was a really amazing experience, and I'm super grateful for. And then after that, went overseas for a bit, and then ran out of money and had to come back to Australia. So applied for a bunch of jobs and ended up getting a gig at the Opera House, managing basically search engine marketing and email marketing. That was the role. It's a bit of a weird channel based role, but then I was there for about 7 years, and in that time I kind of went from that to managing the digital team overall, which was a team of 7 or 8 at the time. And then eventually, before I left, I was acting GM of marketing, so managing the whole team of 50 people at the Opera House, including the creative studio and the brand team. And so that was really fun as well. And my time at the Opera House is something I always look back on fondly. I got to experience so much cool stuff and see so many things and meet so many interesting people. And even though it's a government job and it's a not-for-profit and it's also a commercial business, and so it has all these kind of competing priorities built into it, it's such a great place to work, and had a really amazing experience there. And then went over to Mirvac for a couple of years, heading up digital strategy within one of the portfolio teams there, and was basically doing like social strategy for the business as a whole, a lot of procurement, looking at like marketing technology and their tech stack. So probably spent like 10 years in very digitally focused roles, and then ended up at Heaps Normal. So I'm actually old mates with one of the founders, Ben, the head brewer, and now chief product officer. So a bit of classic nepotism got me in here, and I've been here ever since. And this role has been the broadest role I've ever done in my career. After kind of starting at CommBank and being in a broad brand role, I kind of honed in on digital, did that for 10 years. Now I've expanded back out again. So my role and my team encompasses anything and everything that could be vaguely considered brand marketing. So we do a lot of events. We've obviously got the venue, which we consider as a brand asset first and foremost, before a revenue generating hospitality venue, which it also is, but it's considered part of the brand team. We've got a record label that we run through Heaps Normal that is run by a couple of people in my team. We have obviously all the classic stuff like social media and digital content service within our team as well. We do product releases and campaigns and all that kind of stuff, but the way that we do them is somewhat unconventional. We've got creative and design pretty much all in-house as well. So we've got an in-house designer, we've got an art director who works for us. We work in the agency we really work with a couple of external contractors and a comms and PR agency that we've been working with from the very beginning, Character and Distinction. So yeah, kind of all encompassing as a role and really broad, but my specific role at Heaps Normal is more around kind of brand strategy, creative direction, setting the marketing strategy, setting the calendar, working with the exec to make sure that what we're doing in the brand team lines up with what everyone else is doing in the business, and that importantly, what we're doing ladders up to the kind of vision and objectives of the company. And so a big role that I personally play is in kind of interfacing between my team and the exec and the rest of the business in making sure that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. So yeah, that hopefully gives you a bit of overview of my kind of weird career.
There's certainly some breadth to that team currently, and then obviously your role as well, which I think's really, really interesting. And something you definitely piqued my interest with was the record label, which I don't know if I know too much about. Like, how does that form part of, I guess, of the strategy? And I guess I definitely have seen that music has been an important part of sort of how you guys, how Heaps Normal is branded and positioned itself. I guess, is that an important part, and sort of what's been the unraveling of that?
Yeah, so music has always been a really big part of Heaps Normal's DNA. a lot of us who work here, including myself, have backgrounds in music, whether it's as performers or people working in the industry, or just lovers of music. And so for us, like looking at music as a vertical that we wanted to focus on was just a low lift, natural place for us to start when thinking about things like audience. And so from the very beginning, we've put a lot of effort and time into supporting musicians in the music industry, particularly given that it's an industry that has a lot of traditional problems with alcohol abuse and with, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So I feel like we've played a really important role in the changing culture of that industry, moving it away from, the expectation that if you're in a band, you need to get fucked up every night and never sleep, to something that's a little bit more balanced. So that's always kind of been our, the driving force behind our focus on music. Practically speaking, musicians are, alongside kind of athletes and entrepreneurs and creatives and hospitality workers, who are also a big focus for us. They're kind of the bastions of culture. And so as a culture-led brand, we see a really important role that they're playing as advocates and ambassadors for not just our brand, but for our vision, which is to change drinking culture. So if people are out there seeing athletes, artists, musicians, hospitality workers consuming our beer, it's a good signal that it's okay for them to do it as well. So that strategically has been a big part of why we focus on that vertical as well. And in terms of like what led to the record label, we've done a whole bunch of stuff over the years. Like, we've probably supported at this point, a couple of thousand gigs over the last 5 years, with anything from just beers for green rooms and tour riders, right up to a music festival that we put on called Norm Fest a few years ago, with like 15 bands and 2 stages that we completely produced and programmed ourselves. We've produced kind of some really nice storytelling around friends in bands, like a piece we did a couple of years ago as part of our Normal Friends film series with a band who's old mates of mine called Body Type. And that kind of all led to us going, well, why, if we're doing all this in the music industry, why wouldn't we try and apply that same mentality to trying to run a record label? So we started that at the beginning of last year, and there's 2 kind of aspects to that. One is that we are trying to make the records that wouldn't normally get made. So there's a lot of artists out there that are just slogging it out and they're constantly performing, but they don't have the kind of money to be able to produce a record and sell it and make that back for themselves. So we're basically running this as a not-for-profit record label, where as soon as like our basic costs are covered, the artist keeps all the revenue. So that's one aspect to it. The second aspect is, I probably conflated them, but like making the records that wouldn't have already been made or wouldn't have ordinarily been made because the artists simply couldn't afford to do it. So we're making things that they wouldn't be able to normally afford to do, and we're not for profit. So it's another way that we can kind of support that industry and really imbue ourselves to the artists, particularly the emerging artists out there that are really slogging it and trying to make a living.
I love it. Because I think it's very different strategy and angle to a lot of the brands that I speak with. I don't know many that are playing sort of in that music industry space. So I definitely sort of understand, I guess, that alignment now. That's a bit clearer in terms of how it's always been in terms of music and alcohol, which is really cool. But it definitely seems like you guys do something differently, and that's a really, really important part, I guess, of your strategy. And it seems like you're very culture and I guess even mission sort of focused, which also adds to that difference. Do you mind touching on, you sort of touched on the mission before about, changing that drinking culture. Like, how important has that been in launching? But then you also touched on, not being anti-alcohol or not being pro-wellness, sort of sitting in this new space, which I think is also very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think changing drinking culture has really driven everything that we've done as a business over the past 6 years. And it came from a place of going back to one of my first points that there still are, and there certainly have been serious issues with Australian drinking culture. I grew up in a situation where, I'd go to the park with my mates and drink a case of beer every weekend on a Saturday night. And then, going into my teens and my 20s, it was about who could drink the most to get the most fucked up. And that is quite a rusted on part of Australian drinking culture, or was. And even, looking at films like Wake and Fright that kind of showcase that how many beers can you drink in one night mentality of Australian drinking culture. That's the thing that we're really trying to challenge. And so what we're not trying to do or suggest is that people should stop drinking. We're advocating for and encouraging just a more mindful relationship with booze. And so What that looks like for a lot of people is not going from drinking 15 schooners on a Saturday night to not drinking at all. It's just finding a little bit more balance. And that has then informed our positioning around not being preachy, partly because we don't want to see, we're not advocating for a world without alcohol. We're just advocating for more balance. And also because people don't want to be told what to do. So being preachy and positioning ourselves around, better for you and wellness, we saw that as the expected way for a non-alcoholic beer company to behave. So we decided to actually go in the opposite direction and go, we don't really care how much or little you're drinking, just don't get fucked up. And the wellness part of it actually comes from still doing the things that you typically do when you drink. So going to the pub and hanging out with your mates, going to a gig, going to a game, going to a house party. Like, it's not about how much or how little you're drinking. The wellness bit actually comes from you socializing, partying, and playing. And so that has informed our positioning as effectively the party non-alcoholic beer, where a lot of other non-alcoholic beers have gone down the path of, preaching and sobriety. It's the beer that you drink when you go for a trail run at 5 a.m. or a surf early in the morning. We're kind of the opposite. We're like, it's the beer you drink when you want to stay up all night. So that, I think, has kind of separated us from a lot of the pack, both here and overseas as well, and been a really part of our success, I think.
Yeah, and that definitely comes through, because I think it comes down to understanding, I guess, your consumer, because that really is the Australian culture, and you're sort of trying to be a part of that. And I think trying to tell a large group of Aussies not to drink probably isn't going to work too well, but sort of being an option, for people to have more of that balance and to do more of the things they want to do has obviously worked very well. So it's very clear that it seems like understanding who that target demographic is has been that sort of big unlock to be able to, differentiate yourselves from the rest of the market.
Just understanding the culture, really. Like, we've all spent a lot of time in bars and pubs and talking to bartenders and hospital workers and understanding the culture and being part of the culture. And, we didn't position ourselves in opposition to the culture. We wanted to be a part of it to just steer it in a slightly better direction. And so, again, I think that's what separated us from a lot of the pack. And an example that I often bring up is that we ran a campaign that was called Just Say No to Water, or the alt line was fuck water. And, as a non-alcoholic beer brand, it would be expected that we would be saying fuck alcohol or just say no to alcohol. But we're like, no, the enemy here is actually just boring, bland drinks. It's not alcoholic beer. So we decided to go in the opposite direction and say fuck water instead of fuck alcohol. And that, I think, is representative of our attitude towards the shift we're trying to encourage in drinking culture, not the tear drinking culture down and rebuild it as non-alcoholic again.
And as you've kind of, I guess, set out on this mission, has the core demographic or the demographic that you had in mind changed? Are you appealing to more consumers, less consumers, different age groups? So kind of where does that core customer base lie?
Yeah, there's no active focus on our part on any particular demographic. We believe that most of our current consumers are probably, like, the starting point is probably people like me who are like, late 30s, early 40s, who are trying to cut back a little bit because they can't handle the hangovers anymore. And because they're having kids, they need to find a bit more balance in their life. But every stat that is coming out right now about Gen Z and younger audiences, that they're drinking less and less and less. Like, I think alcohol consumption in Australia and the US is the lowest it's ever been since records began. So there's a focus in a lot of our brand activity on making sure that we're engaging those younger audience as well. And we do that by just being part of the culture. So whether it's the music culture or the hospitality culture or the sports and entertainment culture, making sure that we're in the right places at the right time to connect with them. And we're actually just making stuff that they like, whether it's a record or a piece of merch or a venue. That's how we stay kind of engaged with those younger audiences.
Super interesting, because I see that stat everywhere. Like, that is pushed on social media, in every place in terms of Gen Zs, are not drinking alcohol, essentially. I guess an interesting take would be, are they actually moving towards then alternatives, or are they just not drinking, beer at all, if that makes sense? So they're not even picking up a Heaps Normal. Like, what does that look like?
There's a few layers to it. So, and there's a few reasons why everyone believes this is happening. One is COVID and the fact that they didn't have those formative experiences that people from our generation had, where they were going clubbing every weekend and going to house parties, and they basically had 2 or 3 years where they were stuck at home or start doing very small gatherings. And so the culture of getting fucked up didn't have an opportunity to kind of self-perpetuate through that generation. So that's a part of it. Another part of it, which I find really interesting, is the fear of being drunk and getting filmed doing something stupid. So that's a part of the reason why they've cut back as well. And then I think it's also just the classic, like, rejecting what the generation before you did as well. So I think there's a bit of that happening, and I actually believe that generation will at some point probably have that discovery of alcohol, because it is a fun drug and it's a social drug, and they'll discover it at some point and go, holy shit, we've missed out on years of this, and they'll find their own way through it. I think in terms of alternatives, they're doing more than any generation in the past. Cannabis use is the highest it's ever been in the US, and I think it's probably underreported in Australia as well. Kids are going out and doing ketamine and pingers and all sorts of things as well in place of alcohol, or they're just like doing little bits of things and dosing their night by having a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of alcohol and a little bit of non-alc. And so that idea of kind of like dosing and like blending different stimulants and drugs and alc and non-alc, I think, is a big part of the social and partying experience of younger generations now, which we find really interesting, because we see a role for us to play in that. And then it also for us opens up like potential future categories that we can play in as well. Not that we're going to make a ketamine beer, like cannabis and CBD and like nootropics and things like that mean that we could potentially play a more deliberate functional role in a night out. Is something we've been thinking about a lot as well.
Have you seen the brand Brez at all in the States? It's I believe it's so that they it's quite interesting. The owner on LinkedIn posts essentially his numbers every month, so it's sort of, I guess, that building in public, which is very common these days. But it's been interesting to watch the growth of that business from afar, which really sits in that space that I think you're talking about, and they really do speak to that younger demographic. But I've never thought of that for Heaps Normal, but now as you sort of walk through that big consumer shift and what's changing, and it does open up actually a lot of different avenues to go down, doesn't it?
Yeah, and like if the Gen Zs, if the Zoomers aren't or have never drunk beer or wine or those traditional alcoholic beverages before, it's unlikely that they're gonna pick up a non-alcoholic beer and just get into it, because I know from experience that beer is very much an acquired taste. So if you've never drunk it before, you're not all of a sudden going to be pulled in by non-alcoholic beer. So the challenge for us is that we need to bring those audiences in without the kind of the gateway drug of alcohol building a taste for beer. So that's why we're thinking about and experimenting with other ways that we can kind of engage those audiences with product, whether it's lighter styles of beer or flavor forward stuff or functional or whatever it is. Where we released a sour at the end of last year called Fling, which was very much like the most soda-esque thing we've ever done, and it was like a really juicy, beautiful, flavorful orange sour that for anyone who hadn't ever really drunk beer before, they'd probably drink it and be like, oh, this doesn't even taste like what I thought beer would taste like. So we're continuing to experiment those sort of plays in product to try and appeal to and bring in those younger drinkers.
Now, that makes a lot of sense. And like, I know my partner's not the biggest fan of beer, but anytime I've got a sour, it's the first thing she'll grab and take a sip of. So I can understand the appeal, and kind of, it's I guess lowers the barrier to entry and kind of makes it a little bit more accessible instead of talking about hops and different things that they might have no idea about. So it's pretty easy to understand what orange is and what that flavor profile looks like. So I'm sure it'll encourage a bit of experimentation as well. I know we've kind of touched on, I guess, all of the branding stuff that you guys have done and kind of what the past couple of years have looked like, but would love to, I guess, dive into the retail side of your business. Obviously, that's kind of Luke and I's background, but knowing that you've kind of grown from a bunch of different independents into places like Dan's, and then obviously, launching across UK, US too. Would love to hear, I guess, what your approach to retail has been, and if, I guess, your thesis is kind of aligned with what the retailers are looking for in their categories.
Yeah, I mean, timing was a huge factor for us. Like, we nailed that. And there was a lot of right place, right time involved in, I think, the success of Heaps Normal, but also how we were able to approach and get into a lot of the big retailers, because we really were kind of the first indie craft brand in Australia to hit the market. And so there's also been a lot of really like genuine support from the retailers in supporting a little Aussie brand that is taking on some of the bigger guys, and because of our premium positioning, offering a bit more margin in the process. So that's certainly been a part of it as well. The power of the brand and the success of the brand, and the fact that we've built awareness and preference, particularly in younger drinkers. It has really appealed to the retailers as well, because we're driving demand in their bays in a really creative way as well. And so our strategy is really like to continue to focus on on-prem and hospitality is where the brand building happens. And our belief is that if we are seen and known in the best wine bars and bottle shops and restaurants and bars and music venues, that will actually drive demand at shelf when those people then go in to pick their non-alc beer for the week or the month. So, and the retailers understand that. So I think the strategy is working well in terms of how it's then driving that demand and value in retailers. And also it's making sure that like they're retaining their overall basket size, because the people that used to buy alcohol are now switching to non-alc, and so they're just subbing in on out with what they would have used to have spent on alcoholic beverages. So that's been a big part of how we've sold in as well. We've said, we're not going to destroy your alcoholic revenue. We're going to subsidize it with non-alc alternatives. So that narrative has been communicated really well by our sales team to them. And like I said, they've just been really supportive of us from the very beginning, which has been really amazing as well.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from the basket spend point of view, right? Because the money's going to go somewhere. And so, if it's not an alcohol, it needs to land somewhere else. And so for them to have that alternative and something that actually feels cool, if that makes sense, and kind of, resonates with the consumer that would typically pick up a beer, I can understand the appeal there. For a lot of these kind of bigger retail launches, I mean, it sounds like you mentioned a sales team, but has that been, a result of inbound efforts? Are these retailers coming to you and saying, hey, look, love what you're doing? Or is it kind of the inverse or a combination of both?
Probably a combination of both, depending on the retailer. I think most of them probably came to us first. We've had the benefit of, first mover advantage, and as a consequence of that, being particularly when we launched, we were kind of one of the startup darlings of Australia, and so got a lot of media attention. And we were, one of the things that's worked well for us is just being generous. If we ever catch up with someone, we just send them some beer, and it's like, once you try the beer and you wrap your head around the brand, we're confident that you'll get it and you'll like it and you'll want to stock it. So that's been a really big part of it as well. But yeah, I think the sales team have also done a wonderful job of just working hand in glove with the retailers to understand what stores are performing well and not, what SKUs are performing well and not, whether we're seeing trends for different styles of beer in different geo areas and different stores and store levels and all of that. So the sales team, and Johnny, our head of sales in particular, has done an awesome job of maintaining those relationships. And through the category's been on a massive journey over the last 5 years. Like for a while there, within Woolies and Coles, you had up to kind of like 3 or 4 bays of non-alc, and that's been consolidated down now. We've managed to retain quite a good share of shelf space as that consolidation's happened. And that, I think, comes down to the quality of the brand, the product, and also those relationships that we've built with retailers over the past 5 years.
It's really interesting with the timing piece. I think just prior, I guess it was around COVID, wasn't it, in terms of when that launch was in 2020? Is that right?
Yeah, right bang in the middle of the second wave. I mean, my experience was the first wave, I was drinking every night and like ordering boxes of wine and, drinking half a bottle of whiskey every now and then. And I think everyone was kind of freaking out a bit. And then we had it calm down a bit, and the second wave happened, and that's when Heaps Normal was launched. I think by that point, everyone was like, I'm going to chill this time on the booze. Like, I'm not going to
They learned from the first. Yeah.
I'm not going to write myself off as much as I did the first time. And that was where that idea of us coming in alongside alcohol to kind of complement the experience really kind of started to play out.
Yeah, I think people went one of two ways, didn't they, during that period? It was either double down on the alcohol side or go the opposite, which is pretty funny to look back on. But I guess were like Coles and Woolies at that time, say in 2020, 2021, around that launch time, were they already aware that this was a big movement? Like, what did that look like then? Was there already a category built out? Were these conversations very new? And I know this might have been prior to you, but if you have knowledge on it, what did that look like? Because I assume the conversations nowadays, once you've built the brand, once there's a category in place, the sell is a lot easier. You can pull on a lot more stories and business case, I guess, to get that product on shelf. But what did that look like, 5-6 years ago?
Yeah, like in a lot of Coles and Woolies, the non-alc beer range was maybe a couple of SKUs. Like the Coopers have had a non-alc for 30 years. And so a lot of Coles and Woolies had that stocked in there, but it was usually kind of shoehorned in a really weird part of the store, like, next to the icing sugar and the vanilla essence, you know. So what I think happened is you know, the retailers are looking at the global trends. States, for instance, were, you know, probably, as they usually are, a couple years ahead of us, and so the retailers in Australia are always looking at what's happening in the States and the UK and going, oh, what's that category doing, and how do we bring the right brands in to build on this? And I think we were front and center when they were looking at what was happening overseas. And then I think we built a really strong narrative around our success in on-prem and indie bottle shops, and the built a lot of awareness around the fact that we were breaking into these venues in these bottle shops that you would just not expect would want to have a non-alcoholic beer. And so that was a really good proof point for us to then, you know, build trials with them and get on shelf, and it just expanded from there. And then I think, you know, naturally, like the bigger players in the market, like the Lions and the Asahis and the Heinekens, were also looking at what was happening in the US, investing in non-alc and then pushing their brands onto shelf as well. So we had the situation where we had, you know, rising tide lifting all boats effectively, and the big guys and us and other little players kind of lifting the category up at the same time, supported by all of the data that was coming in from the US and the UK and all the data around drinking. And it was the perfect storm of circumstance for us to be able to kind of work with them on getting on shelf.
Makes a lot of sense. And I guess, what does the wider category look like since then? I assume, you know, when there's always sort of early movers, you know, there's a lot of newness to what you guys did, and then there's going to be a lot of imitators, a lot of copycats come in, a lot of people try to, you know, replicate it, but probably miss the mark on, you know, the mission, the culture, the branding, the ethos that you guys are so clear and you know, so strong on. I guess, what does that look like now? Through that period, was there, you know, lots of brands coming in, lots of entrants, lots of people trying to undercut you?
We still think about it as a rising tide. So like whenever we see a new player in the market, we're like, that's great. Like the more the merrier, really. Like, and there's a lot of really great smaller brands that have launched in specific geographic areas, and so that's really awesome to see. The thing I think that probably for us felt a little bit more advantageous was the bigger brands who had spent years building brands around alcohol, who went, oh, we need non-alc now, and kind of tacked that onto their range. And so I think we're a little bit more cynical of those brands and what they were doing. And a lot of them no longer exist, or they've kind of fizzled out into nothing, or they've been deranged or whatever. But yeah, the category now has definitely matured, and the growth has flattened a little bit more now. And so our focus now shifts to, rather than just driving pure growth, actually looking at what is happening with the category and trying to outperform the category. And that's how we continue to, you know, grow beyond the category, take up market share away from the bigger guys, and continue to kind of play that really important role. So yeah, it's matured. It's still growing. It's one of the reasons why we're looking at like adjacent categories and you know, innovating around beer and kind of opening up the definition of non-alcoholic beer, craft beer, and beer, so that it becomes something that is wider than it's currently perceived. And also why we're looking at other categories like wine as well. And so that's something that we've started to look at, and that we're working on at the moment. So, and that'll probably start as a very small experiment. Like we're not going to all of a sudden become a wine business or not a beer business, but we just want to play these little experiments in different adjacent categories to see if the brand can flex and see what works and what doesn't. And if it doesn't work, we just won't do it again.
I could definitely get behind that. So if you need anyone to test that, those wines, I'm more than happy to put my hand up. But I find it like really fascinating, especially when smaller brands enter a market that's dominated by such big guys. And in this case, it's, you know, Asahi, and it reminds me of, you know, soda brands going up against Coke as an example. And usually there's stories of, you know, those larger brands and those people that have owned the category for so many years trying to block those smaller brands. Are there any stories like that where Heaps Normal has come up against some trouble against some of those bigger guys?
Not really. They've always played pretty nice, to be honest. I think for them, like, non-alc is such a small percentage of their overall revenue that they're happy for us to kind of chug along and do our thing. And like I said, when we kind of entered retailers, like they were entering at the same time. So it's not like they were already there and we were coming in and taking their share. We kind of all hit the shelf at around the same time. So we all kind of grew together through that. And so there's not ever really been a lot of kind of conscious, direct, you know, competition between us and the bigger players, it's all been fairly cordial over the past 6 years.
Not necessarily what I was expecting.
Yeah, to be honest, I've selling a couple of different brands into the UK, especially. You hear stories and you kind of have these direct experience of kind of the big brands will come to these retailers and say, hey, if you pick this brand up, we're really going to squeeze you on margin. Or they'll come back and there'll be other brands that are still emerging but at a much later stage. And if these retailers are picking up a new brand, they'll come in and say, hey, we're just going to double the trade marketing. Can you allocate maybe another 2 facings for us, and it keeps that brand off shelf. So I mean, it's good to hear you haven't seen that just yet.
I mean, it might have happened. I just haven't seen it, or the team hasn't seen it. But I think what's helped us is just, like, again, it's the strength of the brand. It's the fact that we're the most award-winning liquid in Australia for non-alc beer, and it's the premium price position which protects their margins as well. So we've got a lot of the right ingredients for a successful retail recipe, and I think particularly. I mean, it's really everything, but particularly the liquid quality and the fact that we're award-winning, and we're just the beer that tastes most like, we're the non-alc beer that tastes most like alc beer compared to a lot of the other guys has really helped. And then just the strength of our brand, the type of customer we bring in is different to the type of customer who's buying Heineken or Carlton Zero, or whatever it is. So, or Great Northern Zero. So that's helped as well, because we're filling a customer need for them as well.
You've touched on a few of the sort of growth strategies I guess you guys are looking at for the future, being sort of new products, but also new markets. And I think it was early on you touched on the US and the UK.
Yep.
I'd love to touch on, I would dive into that a little bit more. And I think it's interesting you've nailed the understanding of the Aussie culture and what that looks like here. And that's what's obviously helped that growth. Those cultures look very, very different or particularly for the US maybe versus the UK. How are you sort of coming up against, I guess, those markets, and how does that strategy change, and what are the early sort of signs and signals?
Yeah, I mean, the UK is a very translatable culture because it is pub culture, and the cultures are very, very similar. Whether it's sports or music or hospitality culture, they're all quite similar between the UK and Australia. So we found the first kind of 6 to 12 months there, we've actually been growing at the same rate we grew when we launched in Australia, which has been really, really surprising, I think, for everyone, but obviously super encouraging. The US has been a really tough nut to crack because the culture is so different. They don't have pub culture. Their version of like going to the pub and having 15 schooners is the kind of like frat, like sports culture. The kegger house party kind of thing. And so we've still got a lot of work to do to try and break in over there. Our approach in the US, number one, has been to not try and eat the elephant all at once. Like we've focused on the Bay Area and California specifically, and even within the Bay Area, like certain neighborhoods and cities where they have strong music and arts cultures that we can imbue ourselves to. And again, like premium on-prem. So like bars, restaurants, wine bars, music venues that care about the quality of their ranges and don't want to just stock the generic non-alc beer. We've had a lot of success in the US there, but the US has been a much slower burn. Anyone who's done business in the US knows that it's complicated and expensive, and everything costs you twice as much. And it's a really challenging place to do business, whether it's like, brand and marketing work or logistics or whatever it is. There's always a premium in the US. So we're kind of just taking that slowly and probably a little bit more focused on the UK as a market for growth right now.
Costs twice as much and takes twice as long.
Yeah, everything takes twice as long, and even like for us, because beer is a heavy, expensive thing to ship. Our margins are thin over there. Trump's tariffs and the fluctuating exchange rates haven't helped us have confidence in our value chain. So that's been bouncing up and down and all around. And then even just like basic things like packaging compliance in the US, every state has its own laws. States have different laws around employment law and what triggers tax nexus, and there's all sorts of complicated stuff over there. So you've got to have a lot of resilience and patience to even think about the US as a FMCG brand trying to break over there.
Based on those, I guess, kind of factors, I mean, what made you guys take the plunge? Obviously doing extremely well in Australia. Was there a reason why you started to tackle the US now, or, alongside the UK rather than doing one before the other?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of years ago, we decided that instead of trying to do like one thing really well, we'd spent a couple of years playing with like 5 or 6 big bets. And so we decided that was a deliberate strategic choice that we made to experiment with 5 or 6 big things. And then after 2 years, kind of where we are now, like cut that back down to like 2 or 3 and just really honing in on things that are working the most. So we're kind of hedging our bets across a bunch of different stuff. So I guess we looked at like the cultural, the starting point was the cultural similarities between Australia and the US. And I've lived in California and up and down the West Coast, and I know that Californians are the closest to Australians. And so that's why we deliberately decided to launch in the Bay Area, because we saw a kind of cultural symmetry there that didn't really exist in the US en masse. And so that's why we kind of honed in on the places where we could easily translate our strategy overseas. But what we didn't want to do is go over there and like have to reposition ourselves and create a new brand and, new assets and have, the opposite of economies of scale running across those two markets. So that was a big part of why we chose specifically to not eat the elephant, go to California and give it a crack there. And there's also a lot of Aussies in California, whether it's the startup crowd in San Fran in the Bay Area, or entertainment and hospitality in LA. Like there's a lot of Aussies over there, and the great thing about Aussies is they love to help other Aussies. So we've been able to tap into our networks. We've got a lot of investors who have relationships in the US as well that have kind of helped us out along the way. And it's a lot of random Aussies who popped up along the way and just given us a leg up, which has been awesome.
There's a lot of similarities between that sort of big bet strategy, which I'm sure Connor was nodding his head to, with what we sort of learned at Zuru, which I know you mentioned before, but when we were chatting before the pod. But it's interesting, the strategy there was definitely firing bullets, seeing what's working, and then launching cannonballs, towards the things that actually work, which seems like very, very similar to what you guys are doing. And I think I can definitely agree and relate to a lot of the sentiment around the US. I think each sort of state is nearly its own country, and there's obviously different laws and regulations, but then there's obviously also nuances to sort of the culture within each of those states. When trying to build a brand that's nationwide can become very, very challenging trying to do that all at once, and I think that's when some of the cost comes in.
100%. Like California is the 7th largest economy in the world, so it's a country in its own right. So we looked at Cali in particular is just like this huge opportunity, and we're still kind of chipping away at it. So we don't see the US as like this. It's not like the UK where we've just gone bang out of the gates and driving amazing amounts of growth. We're kind of just chipping away at it and keeping our ear to the ground and continuing to work with businesses that we really like. Like for example, Old Mates in New York. That's a really good relationship, being generous and then just chipping away at it. And then I'm confident that at some point in the US we'll have a proper crack through, but it's just taking a bit more time than we thought.
I didn't realize the Stone brothers had Old Mates. I've had a bit of back and forth with Nick with Morning Maid, trying to set up some matcha in Bluestone Lane, which would be cool. But a fan of his from back in the St Kilda days. I'm a St Kilda man myself, so cool to hear that name pop up.
They've been so awesome. I met with both Nick and Andy, and they've been incredibly supportive. And they've connected us with a whole bunch of other Aussies over there who run bars and restaurants and work in the music industry and everything. So again, it's just the Aussie love is strong in the US, which is great.
Yeah, sure is. And definitely there'd be some alignment around sort of that surfing community being involved with Old Mates as well, which sort of takes me to Geordie Smith and I guess his involvement with Heaps Normal. I'd love to hear a bit more about that, how that came about, how involved he is in the day-to-day, if at all. And I guess no doubt there's some assistance there with sort of cracking the US with him as, such a big name.
Yeah, Geordie is his Old Mates with one of the founders, and so that's how he ended up kind of coming in at the beginning. But again, like aside from just being friends with one of the founders, he had a shared passion for the vision that was set around change in drinking culture. And I think as a sports person, he saw his role in that as quite important, and he saw he had a platform and a voice that he could share around that. So he brought a lot of reach to the brand from the very beginning. Has kind of continued to support us mostly behind the scenes in connecting us with other surfers and with friends in the US. and maybe lived in California for a number of years, and lived in LA, and so he's connected us with a whole bunch of people, introduced us to retailers, helped us kind of break down doors that we wouldn't have ordinarily gotten attention enough to break down. So he's been really great since the very beginning, and will probably, as his kind of professional surfing career enters, the golden years, we'll probably start to work with him even more, I reckon, over the next couple of years as well.
It's awesome alignment, and it's insane to think he's still on the tour. I feel like, and not, credit to him, but I feel like he's been around for so long.
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely one of the older blokes on the tour, but he's still crushing it. And he won one of the events last year. I can't remember how old he is. I think he's around my age. I think he's around like 38, 39 or something. So to be still out there doing that's pretty cool. And I don't doubt he'll be out there on the circuit for a long time to come. But I think he's just dialing it back a little bit, which means that he'll probably do a little bit more for us over the next couple of years in place of that.
I think a lot of what we want to do with this podcast is kind of support the next generation of brands coming through. And so there's been a lot of value that you've kind of provided so far. But if you are able to kind of lightly touch on, I guess, the investment piece and how you've kind of navigated that. I know it's kind of big and scary for a lot of brands and they don't know where to start, who to talk to, but would love to hear a little bit about your approach, how you've handled that and how that's kind of informed, I guess, some of the development or kind of the growth of the brand in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I won't talk to the numbers, but what I will say is that we've been very strategic in who we brought on board as investors. We're lucky to have people like Matt DeBoer and Athletic Ventures on board as investors, and Matt and the AV team that then obviously opened up the door to a whole bunch of sports people from across codes. And so whenever we've needed a leg up or for someone to reach out to a retailer and break down a door, or to help us get in touch with a potential ambassador, we've been able to leverage Matt and his team to help us get there really quickly, and a lot more quickly than we would if we were trying to do it ourselves. We've also got a number of people from the music industry like Danny Rogers, who started Laneway Festival. We've got a bunch of people from record labels around Australia on as strategic investors. We brought on Robbie Williams as a strategic investor as well. And we've got a few more that will be coming on board pretty soon as well. And so I think that approach of not just going for private equity or the first person through the door, and actually, trying to deliberately work with investors who can deliver value and deliver growth has been the biggest factor in the success of of that strategy, that investment strategy. So that's probably the one thing I call out. So whenever someone asks me like, how do I raise capital? Who should I bring on board? I'm like, well, think about who can add the most value back to you beyond just being an investor. And that's kind of where I'd start.
And how did you guys go about kind of finding these people early days? I mean, it helps when you've got a fantastic product. Not necessarily the case for everyone, but I know some people can find it pretty difficult to actually kind of attract this initial attention. I mean, it's easier once you've got the momentum, a couple of big names on board. But I'm not sure if you'd be able to share anything about kind of what it was like to kind of get investor one or two on board.
I wasn't there when they were getting the initial investors on board, but the boys went through StartMate at the very beginning through their accelerator program, and through that got access to a whole bunch of potential investors, and then and acquired the first few bigger ones through that, and then Andy and Benny just had relationships with a lot of people in the music industry and sports industry from their previous roles, particularly at Young Henry's, where Andy worked with a whole bunch of people over a number of years there. So I think a lot of it was just reaching out to people that, Andy and Ben thought might be interested in that from the outset. Geordie was obviously a great person to have on board as a strategic investor as well, and as a bit of a proof point for other investors to come on board from those worlds. So that was a really big part of the success, I think, as well.
Cool. No, I think that's perfect. I think, Luke, unless there's anything else on your side, we can probably slowly wrap things up. I mean, Tim, really appreciative of your time and kind of some of the learnings that you've shared. I think beyond being interesting for, other people or actionable, it's just been pretty epic to hear about the journey and kind of your approach to world building in a true sense. I think a lot of brands kind of throw that term around, but what you guys are doing across the record label, you've got the merchandise, obviously a quality product, but then kind of the health club and all the other bits and pieces. It's very cool to see, and it's been pretty fun to watch, I guess, evolve.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
Awesome. I think that's it. But yeah, happy to see, awesome Aussies doing crazy things on the world stage. So yeah, appreciate your time, Tim.